Several years ago, our family walked into 211 for worship on a typical Sunday and encountered a fun surprise. We were handed a loaf of Sara Lee artisanal bread, the good stuff, thick and delicious, better than the bread we typically bought. We saw others were being handed this same bread, a little gift for the day, and began making plans. Grilled cheese was the consensus for lunch. Perfect buttery outside, melted cheese on the inside, mouth-watering perfection. As the service got underway, the pastor asked us to open our bread bag and bring 2 slices to the stage to leave there for his purposes to care for other people. I still remember our disappointment in having to give away a small percentage of what we'd so quickly assumed as ours. And this was bread. Which brings me to our topic today, tithing. If you've not heard this word before, tithe literally means tenth in Hebrew. A tithe is 10% of your income given specifically to your local church, like 2 slices out of a loaf of bread. We see the idea of a tithe, or a tenth, in Genesis 14, where Abraham met with Melchizedek, who was both a king and a priest. After Melchizedek's blessing, Abraham gave him a tenth of everything he had obtained from battle. In Genesis 28, Jacob, after his visionary dream and receiving a blessing from God, promises God a tenth of his possessions. Leviticus 27:30 says, "A tenth of the produce of the land, whether grain or fruit, is the Lord's and is holy." In the New Testament, Jesus mentioned tithes in Luke 11:42, rebuking the Pharisees for neglecting justice and God's love while diligently observing the tithe command. The tithe wasn't put in place for God's benefit. He already owns everything. He doesn't need our money or time or anything else. And we don't have to try to win God's favor, because in Jesus, our Father has already done everything needed to reconcile us to Himself. Instead, tithing is meant for our benefit, as an act of faith that helps us prioritize the things of the kingdom. Consequently, the tithes should be money we set aside first, and then trust God to provide for us to cover our expenses and desires with what's left. I've heard many encouraging stories of God providing and strengthening the faith of His people in these situations, where His people set apart their tithe first, feared they wouldn't be able to cover their expenses, and were amazed at the ways God provided. Like peanut butter and jelly, tithes and offerings are often grouped together, but they're not the same thing. While a tithe is 10% of your income that you give first, an offering is anything extra you give to glorify God and bless His people. In Matthew 6:21, Jesus said, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." We know everything we have, abilities, time on this earth, money, comes from God. In each of these cases, how can we glorify God with what He's given us? We give when we understand the vastness of the Father's love for us in Jesus, and we can't help but pour that love out to others. You want to know the way to avoid greed? To avoid letting your money, my money, have control over us? We give it away. Trust me on this one, if you haven't started giving a tithe yet, and offerings on top of that, this is the year to experience a new kind of peace and joy.